Imagine a modest regional city suddenly forced to host a World Cup final with 0 years of preparation. Picture a local municipal grid built for a quiet daily routine instantly invaded by a population 4 times its size. That is exactly the infrastructure nightmare that unfolded on the streets of Idaho Falls during the 4th of July celebrations. A city of roughly 75,000 residents was suddenly forced to swallow an invading force of 300,000 people pouring in for a single day of parades and a single night of massive fireworks. This is not just a simple story about a crowded street or a busy national holiday. This is a real-time case study in institutional collapse. We are looking at the ultimate paradox of mass civic events. What happens when a cultural tradition becomes so massively successful that the success itself becomes entirely fatal? When we talk about sports governance and international mega events, we frequently discuss the immense pressure placed on host nations. We analyze how massive budgets and years of planning still fail to prevent logistical disasters. But right here in a small American town, we can see the exact same administrative failure happening on a deeply localized but equally devastating scale. The eager crowds cheering for the parade vehicles did not know it yet. They were enthusiastically participating in the self-destructive boom. They were actively celebrating a civic tradition right at the exact moment it was being pushed completely past its physical and structural limits. To understand why the local authorities eventually had to quietly sign a death warrant for their most vibrant public tradition, you have to look closely at what actually happened on those sweltering morning streets. You have to observe how the wild enthusiasm of the massive crowd completely outgrew the boundaries of municipal control. By the end of this investigation, you will understand exactly how the sheer unyielding power of a massive crowd can force an established government body to surrender completely and abandon its own history. Through the eyes of foreign tourists experiencing the grand spectacle from the crowded sidewalks, the morning parade represented the absolute peak of American liberty. The British visitors stood in total awe as they watched a display of organized chaos that would be completely illegal in their home country. They saw endless lines of heavy-duty side-by-side utility vehicles claiming the public streets. They watched modified Cybertrucks roll past the cheering masses. One of those futuristic trucks featured a massive detailed bald eagle painted proudly across its metal body. According to the proud owner who spoke directly to the foreign tourists, that specific eagle artwork took a full hour and a half of dedicated focus to complete. But the absolute height of this unregulated joy came when the foreign visitors found themselves participating in a deeply unbelievable activity right in the middle of the procession. They were actually throwing heavy metal axes at wooden targets mounted on the back of a moving flatbed truck. To an outsider seeking pure entertainment, this was a beautiful display of boundless freedom. It was a raw, energetic street party fueled by pure adrenaline. But if you analyze this specific scene through the cold, unforgiving lens of institutional risk management, the picture changes entirely. This was not a carefully controlled municipal parade. This was a civic apparatus running at maximum velocity without a single safety mechanism in place. In almost any other developed nation in the world, the act of hurling heavy weapons on a moving platform through a dense corridor of thousands of pedestrians would trigger an immediate and forceful intervention. Law enforcement agencies would shut the operation down in a matter of seconds. But in Idaho Falls on that specific morning, it was actively encouraged as a core part of the cultural fabric. The city was effectively letting the massive festival govern itself. The sheer terrifying volume of human bodies made any actual regulatory enforcement mathematically impossible for the local police force. The municipal authorities were completely paralyzed by the massive scale of the cultural monster they had fed over the decades. They could only stand by and watch quietly as the event took on a life of its own. This kind of raw, unregulated momentum is exactly what happens when a local government completely loses its grip on a mega event. The civic infrastructure was visibly cracking under the immense, suffocating weight of human density. Every street corner, every parking lot, and every emergency access route was suffocating under the overwhelming pressure of 300,000 daily visitors. But this massive wave of people flooding into the fragile city grid did not just happen organically. It was not just a simple case of extreme local patriotism reaching a boiling point on a national holiday. The crushing pressure that ultimately destroyed the logistical framework of Idaho Falls was actually the direct result of a severe crisis happening far beyond the city limits. The local regulatory system was failing rapidly because it was taking on a massive, unexpected wave of festival refugees fleeing a completely different geographic disaster. We are talking about a total structural breakdown caused by powerful external environmental factors that nobody in the local government could predict or control. If you want to see exactly how a distant crisis can shatter a highly functioning local system, you need to stay with me as we dig into the unbelievable numbers. Hit that subscribe button right now because we are about to break down the exact demographic anomaly that forced a proud American town to officially raise the white flag and permanently kill its own greatest legacy. The physical infrastructure of any municipal government has an absolute mathematical limit. A city is a living machine, carefully calibrated to support a very specific capacity. Idaho Falls was designed, mapped, and funded to sustain the daily lives and routines of exactly 75,000 local residents. The width of the local highways, the capacity of the sanitation departments, the number of active police officers on patrol, and the structural integrity of the emergency response grid were all precisely engineered for that exact baseline population. But on that specific summer morning, the city was forced to absorb a staggering demographic anomaly. The local authorities were completely overwhelmed by an invading force of 300,000 people. You have to ask yourself how a quiet regional town suddenly becomes the epicenter of such a massive logistical crisis. The answer lies in a perfect storm of external environmental factors and a total failure of regional coordination. This massive wave of human density was not just a spontaneous display of local patriotism. It was a chaotic migration driven by natural disasters happening far across the state borders. Severe and highly destructive wildfires were actively tearing through the dry landscapes of the neighboring state of Utah. Because of the extreme environmental threat, government officials in Utah were forced to implement strict and uncompromising firework bans across multiple jurisdictions. The local residents of Utah were suddenly stripped of their massive holiday explosions, but the cultural demand for the spectacle did not simply disappear because a local government issued a safety mandate. The desire for the celebration simply relocated. Driven by the need to experience the grand tradition, massive waves of festival refugees packed their vehicles and drove north. They drove 45 minutes past the state borders to escape the strict regulations of their own towns. They drove directly into the fragile and completely unprepared municipal borders of Idaho Falls. The host city was suddenly forced to manage a crisis it never asked for and could never truly prepare for. We are looking at a localized civic structure being crushed by the weight of regional environmental refugees. The city was burdened with endless convoys of heavy utility vehicles fighting for non-existent parking spaces. The city was burdened with a population surge that instantly multiplied its fundamental density by 4 in a single morning. The city was burdened with the terrifying reality that their local police force was mathematically incapable of controlling a crowd of that massive scale. How does a local emergency dispatch center handle a total gridlock that traps local taxpayers inside their own neighborhoods? How does a municipal sanitation crew clean up after a transient crowd that outnumbers the actual voting citizens 4-1? Who takes responsibility when a medical emergency happens right in the middle of a street choked with 300,000 tourists and highly modified vehicles? Every single new truck crossing the city limits was actively adding dangerous fuel to the self-destructive boom. Every new family laying down a blanket on the crowded grass was unintentionally pushing the local infrastructure closer to a total catastrophic collapse. We are talking about a civic gridlock so severe that basic government functions cease to exist. We are talking about a total and rapid depletion of local resources unfolding in real time, right in front of the cameras. We are talking about a functioning American town being forcefully converted into a massive, unregulated refugee camp for festival goers. Is it really a successful cultural event when the host city begins to suffocate under the staggering weight of its own localized popularity? The physical reality on the ground was undeniable. The streets were totally paralyzed. The human density was entirely unsustainable. The governmental apparatus of Idaho Falls was bleeding out. But right in the middle of this beautiful and terrifying chaos, a quiet administrative death sentence was being handed down. You have to look at the severe disconnect between the pure joy of the massive crowd and the silent panic of the people in charge. As the sun finally began to set over the crowded valley, the massive throngs of visitors claimed their prime spots on the grass. The foreign tourists from the United Kingdom were completely mesmerized by the sheer energy of the packed streets. They felt the high vibrations of national pride echoing across the dense crowds. They stood in total awe as they watched hundreds of thousands of people happily crammed together, all eagerly waiting for the night sky to ignite. The visitors looked at the massive scale of the gathering and saw a beautiful, untouchable American tradition operating at its absolute peak. They saw the endless rows of heavy-duty vehicles, the chaotic street parties, and the unbelievable sight of people throwing axes from moving trucks, and they interpreted all of it as the ultimate expression of liberty. They believed they were witnessing a cultural institution that would simply last forever. But the hundreds of thousands of people sitting cheerfully on those crowded lawns did not realize they were actually attending a funeral. Behind the closed doors of the municipal offices, the city planners and local officials had already looked at the terrifying data. They had looked at the choked highways, the stretched emergency services, and the impossible mathematics of the crowd density. And they had finally made a monumental, heartbreaking decision. The organizers quietly informed the public that this specific night would be the last big fireworks show the city would ever host. The municipal authorities were officially raising the white flag of surrender. They were entirely abandoning their most famous cultural tradition. They were surrendering completely and unconditionally to the sheer, unmanageable power of the crowd. This is a profound and deeply unsettling administrative tragedy. The local government did not cancel their greatest tradition because they failed to draw a large enough crowd. They did not cancel it because of a lack of funding or a lack of local enthusiasm. They were forced to permanently abandon their own history precisely because they were far too successful. The sheer immense gravity of 300,000 human beings broke the system completely and irreversibly. The beloved tradition was literally eaten alive by the self-destructive boom. It is a terrifying realization for any person involved in public governance. Absolute success can be exactly as fatal as absolute failure. When a municipal event outgrows the rigid boundaries of its own infrastructure, the government loses all of its power. The authorities are reduced to mere spectators in their own city, helplessly watching as the cultural monster they helped create finally devours the entire system. This incredible collapse brings up a fascinating and urgent question about the nature of governance, risk management, and massive public events. when a beloved cultural tradition grows so massive and so chaotic that it actively threatens the physical safety and the structural integrity of the host city itself, do you think the local authorities are absolutely right to kill it completely? Or should they fight to find a way to regulate the chaos, no matter the cost? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below right now, because I want to know if you ultimately side with the rigid safety of the institutional system or the boundless freedom of the massive crowd. The night sky over the packed valley finally erupted in a massive display of brilliant light. But the absolute heaviest moment of the entire evening did not come from the visual spectacle itself. It came from a booming voice echoing across the endless sea of human beings. As the massive crowd stood shoulder to shoulder in the dark, the public address system delivered a staggering historical reality. The voice solemnly honored the first 2 million Americans who have given their lives in wartime sacrifice. Immediately after that profound statement, the organizers formally recognized the 2.5 million active service members currently wearing the uniform to defend the grand promise of liberty. These are incredibly massive numbers. They carry the absolute weight of American history and the ultimate cost of human freedom. But the deep, chilling irony of this specific moment is completely impossible to ignore. The massive crowd was cheering for the ultimate defense of national freedom, while they were standing directly on top of a local municipal grid that was actively dying from a total lack of regulatory control. The host city was honoring the supreme discipline of the military right at the exact moment their own civic discipline had completely evaporated. If you look closely at the governing bodies of international sports, you see this exact same terrifying dynamic play out on a global stage. When a massive governing entity forces a small developing nation to host a massive global tournament, they demand absolute administrative surrender. They force the host cities to rewrite their own tax laws just to accommodate the sheer volume of incoming fans. They demand brand new stadiums. They demand specialized transit lines. And they demand total rigid control over the local infrastructure. The host nations bleed their own local economies completely dry just to survive the sudden violent explosion of international tourists. But the local government of Idaho Falls was experiencing the exact same fatal institutional crushing without any of the massive global funding. They did not have a full decade of careful administrative preparation. They did not have the backing of a massive international committee. They only had their own fragile local grid, and it was being violently torn apart by the relentless, chaotic wave of 300,000 festival refugees. Alongside the completely paralyzed local highways, alongside the mathematically overwhelmed local police force, alongside the total rapid depletion of municipal emergency resources, you have a small regional government staring directly into the terrifying abyss of its own limitations. The sheer unyielding volume of human bodies proved that the system was entirely broken. The massive success of the event was the exact weapon that destroyed the administrative structure from the inside out. The collapse of this massive cultural festival is not just a simple localized story about heavy traffic or a severe shortage of parking spaces. It is the absolute ultimate proof that no institution, no municipal grid, and no governing body can indefinitely survive the self-destructive boom. When you place the wild, unyielding desire of a massive crowd directly next to the rigid physical limits of a local government, something always has to break. The two forces simply cannot coexist in the same confined space. The authorities in this small town looked at the terrifying math and chose to break their own beloved tradition rather than let the endless crowd break the city itself. They officially killed the Grand Festival to save the basic survival of the grid. They traded their most glorious cultural moment for the cold hard necessity of public safety. This tragic administrative surrender forces us to confront a massive moral paradox about how we manage our own societies. Is it better to artificially limit the glory and scale of a cultural tradition so the institutional system can survive? Or do you let the pure joy of the crowd grow massive and wild until the entire structure inevitably destroys itself? The institutional organizers sitting in their quiet offices always have to make the brutal, unforgiving choice. But the ultimate heavy cost of that choice is always paid by the innocent people standing in the crowd. If you want to keep exploring these exact hidden administrative battles where raw human passion collides directly with cold institutional power, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now and stay with me for the next deep investigation. This is not just a simple story about a local holiday parade. This is a defining moment for how we govern the masses. I will see you in the next dark corner of the machine.